The holiest day, 2 p.m., October 6, 1973. Across Israel there was silence. 3 million people knelt in prayer. Children fidgeted in synagogue pews. Mothers lit memorial candles. The entire nation had shut down for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Even the army was practically asleep. In exactly 60 seconds, the world would explode into violence. What they didn't know was that for the past 6 hours, 100,000 enemy soldiers had been moving through the darkness toward their borders. 2,000 Egyptian artillery pieces were aimed directly at Israeli positions. 1,400 Syrian tanks sat engines running, waiting for the signal to attack. At this very moment, in a bunker in Cairo, President Anwar Sadat was staring at his watch, counting down the final seconds to the most audacious surprise attack in military history. In 18 days, this war would push America and Russia to the brink of nuclear war, shatter the widespread belief in Israel's military invincibility, trigger a global energy crisis, and somehow, impossibly, lead to the Middle East's first lasting peace. But first, the region would descend into chaos. This is the story of the day that changed everything. The overconfident giant. 6 years earlier, Israel had achieved the impossible. In just 6 days in 1967, this tiny nation crushed 3 Arab armies, capturing territory 4 times its original size. The victory was so complete that it fundamentally changed how Israelis saw themselves. They had become the region's undisputed military superpower. Along the Suez Canal, Israel constructed the Bar-Lev Line, a chain of fortifications they believed was impregnable. Israeli military leaders boasted that no Arab army could breach these defenses. "The Arabs will never dare attack us again," declared Defense Minister Moshe Dayan. But in Cairo and Damascus, humiliation burned like a wound that refused to heal. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Syrian leader Hafez al-Assad began planning something unthinkable, a coordinated surprise attack to reclaim their lost honor. They chose their timing with calculated precision. Yom Kippur, when Israel's reserve-based military would be most vulnerable, when soldiers would be scattered in synagogues instead of at their posts. Israeli intelligence detected Arab military movements, but dismissed them as routine exercises. After all, what army would be foolish enough to attack the mighty Israeli Defense Forces? They were about to find out. The world explodes. As afternoon prayers began across Israel, the world exploded into violence. On 2 fronts simultaneously, Arab armies launched their assault. In the south, 8,000 Egyptian commandos stormed across the Suez Canal. In the north, 1,400 Syrian tanks thundered into the Golan Heights. The Egyptians used high-pressure water cannons to blast through Israel's impregnable Bar-Lev Line like it was made of sand. Within hours, 5 Egyptian divisions were across the canal, equipped with Soviet anti-tank missiles that could destroy Israeli armor at 3-kilometer ranges. On the Golan Heights, the situation was even more desperate. 180 Israeli tanks faced an armored avalanche of Syrian steel, outnumbered 7-1. Lieutenant Colonel Avigdor Ben-Gal later recalled, "I saw our tanks burning like torches in the valley. I thought this was the end of the state of Israel." In 72 hours, Israel lost more soldiers than in the entire 6-day war. Reserve units raced to the front lines, some still wearing their prayer shawls from Yom Kippur services. For the first time since 1948, the survival of Israel hung by a thread. America steps in. October 9th. As Israeli ammunition ran dangerously low, President Richard Nixon made a fateful decision. Against his own State Department's advice, he authorized Operation Nickel Grass, a massive airlift to resupply Israel. American C-5 Galaxy aircraft began landing in Israel every 30 minutes, delivering everything from tank shells to fighter jets. The Arabs responded with an oil embargo that quadrupled petroleum prices worldwide, but Nixon doubled down on Israeli support. The impact on the battlefield was immediate. Israeli forces, resupplied and reinforced, began launching increasingly effective counterattacks. On the Egyptian front, General Ariel Sharon executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, crossing Israeli forces to the western bank of the Suez Canal. Meanwhile, on the Golan Heights, 20-year-old Lieutenant Zvika Greenberg became a legend. When Syrian tanks overran his position, he fought a 20-hour running battle, jumping from destroyed tank to destroyed tank. His radio call sign, Zvika Force, became legendary, with Syrian commanders believing they faced a major formation when it was often just one tank with a wounded crew. Slowly, incredibly, the tide began to turn. Israeli tanks were suddenly advancing toward Cairo and Damascus. Nuclear brinkmanship. But as Israeli forces closed in on the Arab capitals, the crisis escalated beyond anyone's imagination. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, facing the complete collapse of Soviet influence in the Middle East, sent a direct message to Nixon warning of necessary actions unilaterally if Israeli advances continued. Soviet airborne divisions were placed on alert. Nuclear-capable missiles in Eastern Europe began fueling. Nixon's response was swift and dramatic. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, American nuclear forces went to DEFCON 3, alert status. For several terrifying hours, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. The crisis that had begun as a regional conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors had escalated into a potential Third World War. Salvation came through desperate diplomacy. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, working with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, negotiated a ceasefire resolution. Both superpowers agreed to pressure their allies to halt military operations immediately. On October 24th, after 18 days of fighting, the guns finally fell silent. The price of war, the human cost, was staggering. Israel lost 2,656 soldiers, killed, devastating for a nation of only 3.2 million people. Arab casualties were far higher, estimated between 8,000 and 18,500 dead across all forces. But the psychological impact was equally profound. For Israel, the myth of invincibility had been shattered forever. The failure of Israeli intelligence became a national scandal. Prime Minister Golda Meir would eventually resign. Her career ended by the intelligence failures that nearly destroyed her country. For the Arabs, despite ultimately losing territory, there was psychological victory. Egyptian and Syrian forces had achieved surprise, crossed Israeli fortifications, and fought Israeli units on equal terms. Arab dignity had been restored. The global consequences were immediate. The Arab oil embargo created the first major energy crisis since World War II, triggering worldwide recession. For the first time, Arab nations had demonstrated they could influence world events through economic pressure rather than military force. From war to peace. Yet the war's most significant consequence was entirely unexpected. It created conditions for the first Arab-Israeli peace treaty in history. The war had achieved Sadat's primary objective of breaking the military stalemate and restoring Arab dignity. For Israel, it revealed the enormous costs of maintaining the status quo through military force alone. Both sides had fought to exhaustion without achieving decisive victory. American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger recognized unprecedented diplomatic opportunities. He began intensive shuttle diplomacy, negotiating step-by-step agreements between former enemies. The real breakthrough came in 1977 when Anwar Sadat made his historic visit to Jerusalem, becoming the first Arab leader to set foot in Israel. This electrified world opinion and created momentum for serious negotiations. The Camp David Accords in 1978, mediated by President Jimmy Carter, established the framework for peace. In exchange for complete Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, Egypt agreed to full diplomatic relations with Israel. The Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty, signed in 1979, formally ended 30 years of warfare. Sadat was assassinated in 1981 by militants opposed to his peace efforts. But his legacy survived. The removal of Egypt from the coalition threatening Israel fundamentally altered the regional balance of power. Legacy. The Yom Kippur War proved that even the most bitter enemies could find paths to coexistence when the costs of conflict became unbearable. It was the last major conventional war between Arab states and Israel. It marked the emergence of oil as a strategic weapon. It demonstrated both the possibilities and dangers of superpower rivalry. Most importantly, it showed that military force alone cannot resolve deep-seated political disputes. The war's ultimate legacy was not the destruction it caused, but the peace it made possible. On October 6, 1973, two nations went to war seeking to restore their honor through military victory. Egypt wanted to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula. Israel wanted to maintain security through continued dominance. In the end, both discovered something more valuable: the wisdom to choose negotiated settlement over perpetual conflict. The soldiers who died in the Yom Kippur War did not die in vain if their sacrifice led to greater understanding between their peoples. Sometimes it takes the shock of near disaster to convince adversaries that they have more to gain from cooperation than confrontation. The day that began with prayers for atonement became a day of warfare that ultimately led to a more profound reconciliation. The recognition that former enemies could become partners in building a more peaceful future. Stories like this deserve to be told. If you agree, hit subscribe and don't miss the next one.